I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement here at JTS, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our fall series, 6 Days Shall You Labor, Perspectives on Work in Jewish Text and Tradition. And as you know, we're exploring all kinds of themes related to work in Jewish life, professions that Jews have held, thoughts, ideas in Jewish thought on work and rest. And today, the Jewish middle class in an age of social justice. So kind of a new session compared to what we've had this fall. First of all, zooming to the modern period, the contemporary period, and kind of really getting into the philosophy and the class and the politics of how we think about work. We're so pleased to have our alum, Dr. Nancy Sinkoff, teaching us today. She is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers University and a JTS Fellow. And many of you have had the pleasure of learning with her before in our Monday series. I also want to welcome everyone who's joining us for the first time today. If you're feeling inspired by this opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to partner with us by sponsoring a learning session. And Tani is putting information on sponsorship into the chat, but you can learn more by contacting learninglives@jtsa.edu. And on that note, I will turn it over to Tani to give us some instruction regarding Q&A.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to go over the Q&A for today's session, Dr. Sinkoff will pause for questions periodically throughout the class. We will also have a Q&A period at the end. You can use your chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Sinkoff. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with myself or with Lynn Feynman. The PowerPoint presentation for today's class was in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session, and we'll be screen sharing as well. So pleased to introduce Dr. Nancy Sinkoff, Professor of Jewish Studies and History, and the Academic Director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life at Rutgers University. Dr. Sinkoff has written several books, most recently From Left to Right, Lucy Dawidowicz, the New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History, which we will be drawing from in today's session. Dr. Sinkoff was in the inaugural class of JTS Fellows in 2015. The JTS Fellows program is an initiative to expand and diversify JTS's adult learning opportunities, and we're really excited to have Dr. Sinkoff continue to teach on behalf of JTS. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Sinkoff.
You're still muted, Nancy.
Oh. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. Happy to see such a nice group of people, although remotely. And I want to thank Rabbi Andelman and Tani Herman Schwartz for helping me get this together technologically and otherwise. Despite all my experience with Zoom, there are always issues. So thank you so much. I'm delighted to be part of this series. And as Rabbi Andelman and Tani mentioned, I'm a very proud alum of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I have a master's degree in Judaic Studies and also was a fellow of the inaugural class. So the seminary means a lot to me and rooted me to continue my research into the Jewish past. So thank you. The Jewish middle class in the age of social justice. Well, I think we're in a very particular moment right now. As American Jews, a certain kind of very important reckoning is going on about our society. I would say that this reckoning has happened before. We can look at Reconstruction, we can look at the Progressive Era, we can look at the Civil Rights Movement, but for all kinds of reasons in our society, the full promise of democracy has not yet been made or has not arrived. And the question that we have as American Jews, although maybe there's some international there's an international audience here, so forgive my nationality assumptions here. There is a moment where American Jews right now are thinking, where do we fit in this current so-called progressive moment? So I'm going to put up some questions for you that I hope will be in your head as we move forward. And I'm going to take you through a big swoop of history, and then we're going to end up with a very interesting essay that was published by Lucy S. Davidovich posthumously in a collection after her death about rethinking the question of the Jewish middle classes. And the reason why I thought this was an apposite topic for today is that the majority of American Jews, not all by any stretch, but the majority of American Jews today would define themselves as socioeconomically middle class or upper middle class. And the question is, where does social class fit in discussions today about social justice and racial reckoning? And I don't necessarily have answers for you, but I want to give you the questions. So here are questions that we're going to look at.
Dr.
What are
Sinkoff?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry to interrupt. A few participants mentioned that they're finding the closed captioning distracting. So I don't know if I'm going to try, if I screen share instead of you, I don't know if that will stop that, but that was the only way I could think of to.
Okay, I mean, it is helpful for other people, but I don't know what to say. That's your call.
Yeah, I get. I'm not really sure what to do about that, but I suppose.
How about now? Is it gone?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is gone now.
Okay, so I made the screen bigger and I hit a button that had a keyboard on it.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Let's hope. Okay, so here's some of the questions that we should just think about. They're not all going to be addressed, but they're questions we want to think about. What are the obstacles, if there are obstacles, for Jews today? Sorry, let me just move this. For Jews to be part of the current progressive moment in American politics. If the Jewish community, speaking broadly, views the middle class as a bulwark of civic stability, what roles can it play in movements to redress socioeconomic inequality? Can the Jewish community reconfigure its own values of upward socioeconomic mobility to be more in sync with, quote, progressive social groups? And should it reconfigure its values? In other words, can the Jewish community be an ally in the social justice agenda for the redistribution of wealth, right? That's a big question. And what is the modern Jewish history that informs these questions? So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go through history from the late 18th century until Lucy Davidovich's essay in the 80s and 1990s. And then we'll circle back to these questions. And I hope we can have some kind of discussion as we go through. So let's start with, if you will, the problem or a set of problems. We can't go back to the medieval period. I don't have time to do that, but some of you may be aware that during medieval times, there was the perception, and it was deeply rooted in stereotypes about the Jews, that the Jews were not only concentrated in certain professions, but that those professions were problematic. And those professions were often defined as money lending or usury, or as I like to say to my students, the extension of credit, right? The extension of credit. And this is a long history, a very polemical history about the roles of Jews in the medieval economy. And I mention this to you because by the time you get to the early modern period, that's the late 18th century, when the Jews, and here we're primarily talking about Ashkenazic European Jewry, encounters the Western centralizing state, that image, that stereotype of Jews of being concentrated in certain professions, and that those professions had a certain kind of immorality to them, is part of the ideological landscape of European society. Both non-Jews and Jews are aware of the perception and believe to many degrees, the perception that Jews are concentrated in certain kinds of activities economically, and those activities are somewhat problematic, right? So when we look at what happens in the late 18th century in Prussia, Russia, and Austria, and we're going to do this very quickly because we do want to get to Lucy Davidovich, we will notice that all of the authorities, the centralizing absolutist authorities, were concerned with Jewish economic behavior, and also concerned with the concentration of Jews as an urban people and with commerce. So here we have just one quote from the Prussian context from Christian Wilhelm von Dohm, who was an advisor to Frederick the Great. And he wrote an extremely important treatise that is cited in every book on modern Jewish history on the civil improvement of the Jews, or on the improvement of the civic status of the Jews. It's a difficult translation. And here he says in 1782, the hard and oppressive conditions under which the Jews live almost everywhere would explain, although not justify, an even worse corruption than they actually can be accused of. It is very natural that these conditions cause the spirit of the Jew to lose the habit of noble feelings, to be submerged in the base routine of earning a precarious livelihood. The varied oppression and contempt he experiences are bound to debase him in his activities, to choke every sense of honor in his heart, as there are almost no honest means of earning a living left to him. It is natural that he falls into criminal practices and fraud, especially since, that's a typo, commerce more than any other trades seduces people to such practices. No humiliating discrimination should be tolerated. No way of earning a living should be closed to them, none other than the regular taxes demanded from them. So Christian Wilhelm von Dohm was in favor of the integration of the Jews into Prussian society. He was an ally, as we might say today. But he had incorporated in his allyship a view that Jewish economic practices heretofore in his time debased the Jews, that it made them subject to criminal behavior, that they were somehow morally corrupt, and that the solution to this was to transform their economic behavior. No discrimination against them should be tolerated. Professions should be opened up to them. And if the Jews could be transformed economically, they would be transformed morally. And that the problem lay with the European state. So he has a bias, absolutely has a bias, but he says the problem has been the way the Jews have been treated. And you, Frederick the Great, and the absolutist powers in Prussia, if you do what's correct to make your society benefit from all of its subjects, and I put terms at the top that should help you. The idea was that there'd be a well-ordered state that could produce civil happiness. There would be the usefulness of all its subjects. The state was paternalistic. The subjects would be dutiful. They would all be productive. If the state did what was right rationally, it would allow Jews to work differently. And if they worked differently, they would be transformed morally and physically, by the way. I mean, there's a lot more in this text than I can get into, but it's very important to see that he urges the state to be more tolerant and open, because only with toleration will the Jews change. He wants the Jews to change. Okay, so that's Prussia. Here we have Austria, and you'll see some of the same language. Joseph II was the co-regent with his mother, and then from 1780 to 1790, he ruled, and he absorbed a lot of Ashkenazic Jews. When Poland was partitioned, he issued a series of edicts to transform all his great empire. And one was a toleration edict for Austrian Poland, known as Galicia, and in 1789. And you'll see what he says. Permission is given to the Jews to work at any occupation and administrative business allowed by law. From now on, all restrictions that existed until now and were imposed only on the Jews will be completely abolished. The Jews will be forbidden to lease more than what encourages that diligence that the state means to instill in the Jews. By leasing, that has to do with leasing immovable property, which was a main commercial activity of the Jewish community. And the state will allow it if it's good for the state. Beyond that, which only increases idleness, right? Being a leasee and a rentator encourages idleness, we are told by Joseph II's patent, and until activity and diligence in other occupations has become widespread among them. So you see the same impulse. If the Austrian state will stop discriminating against Jews, if it will open up other professions, Jewish economic activity will be transformed. They won't be concentrated in professions that allow them potentially to be idle. And nothing is worse than a well-ordered absolutist state than idleness, right? One should be productive because then you will be a good and useful subject for the emperor, right? In addition to manual labor, note that inherited occupations and leases are allowed to Galician Jews in all trades and all manner of goods, as long as they keep the general laws of commerce and manage their register book according to the directives and in the language of the state. So what you see there, and we can talk about it later, is that the state also wants to make sure that all the internal communal books of the Jewish community are no longer written in Hebrew and Yiddish, right? Because they want to be able to understand what the Jews are doing economically. By the way, this was not, quote, anti-Jewish. This was part of the state's control and centralizing ethos of this period, right? It wanted to know what all its subjects were doing. And the Habsburg Empire was multicultural, multi-religious, and multilinguistic. And Joseph II and everyone else in Vienna wanted to be able to read what was going on among their subjects. Of course, the Jewish community perceived it as an assault, but that's a different question. But I want you to notice again, manual labor should be open to them. Again, the assumption is that Jewish commercial, middle-class, retail, trade activities need to be transformed, and Jews need to do other things, including be involved with manual labor. So that's Austria. And last, we have the Russian Empire. These are edicts of 1804, Alexander I, and this is one section of his legislation that ultimately didn't go very far, but you see the impulse, the status, occupation, and rights of the Jews. All the Jews are to be divided into 4 classes: farmers, manufacturers and craftsmen, merchants, and city dwellers. Jews who are farmers, as well as those who are manufacturers, craftsmen, merchants, and city dwellers, are allowed to purchase and own property in the unpopulated areas of the provinces of Lithuania, Belarus, Little Russia, Kiev, etc. They may sell the land, lease it, bequeath it, or bestow it as a gift. No Jew will be compelled to engage in agriculture in the aforementioned provinces, but those who do shall be exempt from payment of taxes for a period of 10 years. So again, what do we see here? We see that the European state would like Jews to move into new professions, including manual labor and agriculture, okay? Move them away from the commercial activities of the middle class. Well, how did the Jewish community respond? That's a long and complicated question, but I want to tell you that some Jews, not all, some Jews welcomed the state's commitment, if you will, to transforming Jewish education and the Jewish economy. And those Jews were known as maskilim, or Enlightened Jews. Those were forward-looking European Jews who felt that the integration of the Jewish community, the Ashkenazic Jewish community, into the European state was a value. And they had also absorbed the view that Jewish commercial concentration in the middle classes was problematic. And they blamed it both on the Gentile state, and they also blamed it on the educational system that they had inherited from the medieval and early modern Ashkenazic rabbinate, which was the focus on Talmudic study for men, to the exclusion of working, quote unquote, with their hands and being involved with productive labor. So here you see a quote from Naftali Hertz Vesely, or Weissel. He was a maskil in Berlin. He wrote an extremely important manifesto on Jewish education, in which he also talks about Jewish work. And you can see his positive attitude towards Joseph II. Joseph II has not forgotten the poor people long abused, that's the Jews. He gave us many good and consoling commands. He has unshackled the disabling bonds by permitting the Jews to engage in all forms of cultivation of the land, to work in all crafts and trade, to trade in all merchandise. Arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, history, and geography are to be studied from existing books used by the children of the kingdom, for these sciences do not impinge upon faith. Knowledge of these subjects can only strengthen the house of Israel and mend the breaches made by preceding rulers. And thus the children of Israel will also be men who accomplish worthy things, assisting the king's country in their actions, labor, and wisdom. So here you see again, a maskil, an enlightened Jew, a forward-looking Jew saying, my people understand that the changes that the centralizing absolutist authorities want to see in this community are good for us. It will make us more like men. We will be part of the country that we are integrating into, and we will have other kinds of professions. And Naftali Hertzweisel spends an enormous amount of time in this treatise talking about Jewish education, that Jews need to learn secular subjects, and that armed with the vernacular language of the state, they will be able to participate more broadly in the economy. And they won't just be, in fact, idle Talmudic scholars, okay? And just to continue this theme, and then I'll stop for questions, Avraham Ber-Gotlober, a Russian maskil, relating his own thoughts when Isaac Ber Levin's son published Testimony in Israel in 1828. He said that the book was to explain how important education was. Besides learning Hebrew systematically, one should learn other languages, and not content with stimulating the young people to seek knowledge. Isaac Ber Levinson tells us, Avraham Ber-Gotlober, he also petitioned the government to establish Russian language schools for Jews and to teach them skills necessary to till the soil. So again, you see this impulse towards manual and agricultural labor. Finally, Yehuda Leib Gordon, the most important Hebrew poet of the 19th century, wrote a very important poem in 1866 under the reign of Alexander II, considered the liberal czar, that's somewhat oxymoronic, a liberal czar. Hekitza Ami, wake up my people. And you see, become an enlightened people, second stanza. Become an enlightened people, speak their language, meaning learn Russian. Every man of understanding should try to gain knowledge. Let others learn all manner of arts and crafts. Those who are brave should serve in the army. The farmers should buy plows and fields. So he too, as Isaac Ber-Gotlober, as Levin's son, as Naftali Hertzweisel, as enlightened Jews, they welcome the encouragement on the part of the absolutist state to transform Jewish work and Jewish education. So I want to pause here and stop sharing and take some questions, and then move on to the Marxist and socialist critique of Jewish middle class work. And then we'll move in the third section to Lucy S. Dawidowicz's essay in the American context. So that was a lot. It was a broad sweep, but I'm open to questions. And I think Rabbi Andelman, you're going to hand me them?
Yes. Thank
Yes.
you.
Okay.
Okay, so one person just asked, I'm just going to read it the way she wrote it. Surely there must have been Jews who learned secular subjects before these edicts, doctors, lawyers, question mark. Is she correct?
So lawyers, I'm not sure where my questioner is getting that. Lawyers, as you had to go to law school, you had to be allowed to go to your European law school, and that Jews studied Jewish law. They didn't study Gentile law for the most part. In terms of doctors, doctors is a sort of an exception, a very interesting exception. We know that Jews studied medicine, for example, in Italy. And that was and in the medieval period, we also know that Jews studied medicine, but Italy was open to Jews studying medicine, and some Ashkenazic Jews did go, for example, to the University of Padua and studied medicine. Certainly there were Jews who knew secular subjects, but there's a difference, and this is very important in terms of ideology. There's a difference in learning the vernacular language for a trade or for pragmatic reasons, and an ideological commitment to learning the vernacular as a feint towards modernization as a value, right? It's different when Naftali Hertzweisel, Yehuda Leib Gordon, and all these masculine say, Jews should learn the vernacular language because that will transform them into modern people. That's very different than a traditionalist, or you think of even a Maimonides or others saying, I mean, Maimonides is exceptional. So let's not take that example, but another Jew who might have studied medicine and knows Italian, but it's not a value per se, it's just part of his, and I think I can use the male pronoun, his life in order to have this profession. The Maskilim and the absolutist emperors are saying the Jews need to be transformed into modern Europeans, and the way they need to do that is learning the vernacular and expanding the range of work that we're defining now as productive. So that's how I would respond to that question. In the 18 teens and 20s, Jews in German lands and Prussia do go to law school, but they're actually prevented because the Prussian Jewry law of 1812 is not comprehensive. They actually can't really practice law. In the late 1860s and 70s, there's a selective group of Jews in St. Petersburg, mercantilist, Jewish notables who do attend law school in Russia. They become very important from the 1860s until the first Russian Revolution. So Jews do attend law school, but it's later than our late 18th century period.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another person is, I guess, expressing skepticism about were these edicts really trying to assimilate the Jews in kind of an inclusive way, or was there some ulterior motive, such as a labor shortage? They needed Jews in these professions. And a few people are also asking about anti-Semitism, which I don't think you've said that word, but sort of how does that figure into all of these attitudes that you're talking about?
The problem is if I say the word anti-Semitism, we won't move 1 inch. That's the problem, right? So let's just save that to the end if we can. And I just I'm sure Rabbi Endelman and Tanya, you're well aware of this, the term anti-Semitism in the last 3 years is undergoing scrutiny in a petri dish of, the numbers of volumes that have been produced by my colleagues in the last 3 years on anti-Semitism as a word, as a concept. So I don't even want to touch it right now because any definition will be unsatisfactory. I will say that the absolutist state's goal was that every subject be useful, from a peasant to a Jew. And did they like these people? Did they like their Jews? Did they like their peasants? No, they couldn't have given a hoot. What they wanted was an expanding economy. And that's why you see some absolutist emperors talking about emancipating the serfs, right? They want the labor of their serf population to go to them and the state and not to the nobility that controls the land. So the same thing is true of the Jews. It's not so much a labor shortage, it's that it's a new political economy of the state. That's what mercantilism is, a word I just threw out there for you, or cameralism, which is civic duty to the state, and centralizing absolutism. All of those phrases come together in the late 18th century as these European empires are bolstering the power of the top, right? And they're doing it against a feudal economy, which was actually had more horizontal players, if you will. So labor shortage, by the way, to me strikes me as so 19th century. I wouldn't necessarily use that in the 18th century. But yes, they want an expanding economy. And they're also trying to figure out what to do with all of these Jews. The Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Prussian Empire did not have large Jewish populations before 1770, right? Everything always goes back to the partitions of Poland, but I don't want to get stuck on my favorite subject. So I hope I answered that question.
Yes, very well, thank you. Do you want to take one more?
Sure. I'm happy, but I'm looking at the time.
So yeah, so let's do one that maybe you can dispense with quickly. So we all know that in Israel there are all kinds of universal civic responsibilities from which the Haredi community is exempt, and the question is, how did these edicts impact or not impact the ultra-Orthodox community?
Okay, so first, it's a wonderful question, and it's a wonderful question because it shows you, I hope, that that's why the study of history is the best subject. Sorry. And it also shows you that history iterates. It doesn't repeat itself. The Santayana quote that gets thrown out at every bar mitzvah and high school graduation is pablum, but history does iterate. There are questions that come up over and over again. And so what you see here is that these edicts are are directed at the Jewish community, are urging the Jewish community to have a different educational system and therefore a different economy. And we don't really have Haredim exactly in the late 18th century, although we are beginning to see differences in traditional Jewry, like the beginnings of what we then will call neo-Orthodox or Orthodox, the difference between Western European Orthodoxy and East European Orthodoxy. And certainly certain rebbeim in Central and Eastern Europe loathed these edicts and did everything to avoid them. They did not want to change the Jewish educational system. They did not want their male children being inducted into the army. They did not want their children to learn German or go to German language schools. So the beginning of a resistance to integrationist modernity is in this period, absolutely. The modern state of Israel is, again, it's a great question because it shows you that the modern state, the history of the modern state of Israel is part of modern Jewish history. The same questions that European Jews were faced with and later American Jews were faced with, contemporary Israelis are faced with, right? So it's not a sequestered, siloed history. The modern state of Israel is faced with the same question of how to create a civic society. And it's challenged because of remnants of theocratic rule. Full stop, we'll leave it at that. We can take more later. So are we moving on?
Yes,
I can go back to my screen share.
Yeah, and I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, please submit them to me, Rabbi Julia Andelman, in the chat. Okay, so I'm gonna move on, and then we'll take more questions. Okay, Rabbi Andelman, just confirm with me, or someone confirm with me that you can see the PowerPoint. Looks
okay, good.
The closed caption is back on.
Oh no. Okay, let me see. Oh, you know what? I got rid of it.
There we go. And I think that those who need closed captioning, the participant can enable that in Zoom. So presumably those who need it know how to enable that for themselves. That's great. That's great. Thank you so much. I think that's true, and I'm not sure. Anyway, I just learned something new that I could control, and I thought it was built into the Zoom settings. So we're going to jump out of the 19th century and the late 19th century. And again, this is a mad race. It's important to understand that the economy itself is moving in Europe, is moving from agriculture to industry, right? The Industrial Revolution begins in England and moves to the continent and makes its way slowly to the Russian Empire. Just to sort of throw out something to tickle your brain, you know, the moves under Stalin in the 30s, one could look at among many things as an effort to industrialize the Russian Empire, which was backward economically, right? So we have a long 19th century of industrialization, and different societies industrialize at different rates. Marx is the bourgeois son of a Central European Jewish family, a baptized family, and becomes obviously the major thinker with Engels on what we call political economy and on the nature of human emancipation. And Marx distinguished between political emancipation and human emancipation. And for him, human emancipation was the highest threshold. That is what one should aspire to. And in his mind, in order to be emancipated as a human being, it meant overturning the capitalist system. That is the system in which there was a group of people who owned, and this is Marxist terminology, the means of production, and a group of people who sold their labor power. That's the proletariat, the working class. And in selling their labor power, they also gave up what he called their species being. This is, Marx 101 or the early Marx 101. And this is just to give you a sense of some of the terminology that will be used by Marxists from the 1850s forward. And also the problematic in Marx's understanding of the efforts in the revolutions of 1848 to emancipate the Jews politically, that is to give the Jews political rights. Again, it's a huge topic, but what I want you to understand here is for Marx was not in favor of Jewish political emancipation. He was actually on the left on these issues, but he thought it was insufficient.
So he thought the efforts to emancipate the Jews politically, to give them political rights, was the penultimate societal transformation. It was like focusing on the next to last stage of human development. And in his writing about Jewish political emancipation, when he's responding to various thinkers in his circles, he focuses on the Jews and their economic life. And it's in this essay on the Jewish question, which is infamous or famous, depending upon your views, in 1844, Marx associates Jews with commerce. And again, there's enormous scholarship on this because many people, prominent people, including Shlomo Avneri in Israel, a very important political economist, argue that Marx is not an anti-Semite, right? Here's the word everyone wanted to hear. It's, however, very difficult to read on the Jewish question and not cringe as a Jew because of his linguistic and metaphorical association of Jews and commercial activity. And commercial activity is predatory and problematic. And commercial activity, or the middle-class professions, are penultimate in terms of human emancipation. So here's the quote, and it will make you cringe, right? If you Jews want to be emancipated politically without emancipating yourselves as men, right, that's human emancipation, the incompleteness and contradiction is not only to you, it is in the nature and category of political emancipation, right? Political emancipation is insufficient. That's what Marx is saying. What is the worldly basis of Judaism? Practical necessity, selfishness. What is the world culture of Jewry? Commerce. The emancipation from commerce and from money, from the practical real Judaism, would be the self-emancipation of our age. So this is a metaphor, but it's a very ugly metaphor. He's saying that human emancipation, the final stage, the end of capitalism, the beginning of a communist economy, can only happen if the whole commercial structure of capitalism is overturned. And he's associated that with the terminology of the Jews. Money debases all gods of men and transforms them into commodities. Money is the common value of all things constituted for itself. So it robbed the whole universe, the world of men, of nature, of their specific values. Money is the essence of man's labor and existence, alienated from man, and this alien being rules him and he adores it? Question mark. So again, this is taken out of context of a much longer essay, but basically what I want you to see is that in Marx's criticism of capitalism, of the ownership of the labor power of working men, of the proletariat, who owned nothing except their ability to labor by a class of owners, of capitalist owners who owned the means of production, human society was corrupt. And the only salvation, and I think salvation is the operative word, would be when capitalism actually collapses on its own energy. I mean, Marx believed there was a teleology of the economy and a communist collective economy would emerge. That's Marx in a nutshell. And his critique, though, of commerce here uses the Jews as a metaphor. And the reason I mention this to you is that Marx will become obviously canonical in any society in Europe that adopts socialist Marxist rhetoric. And this text will become part of an arsenal of a certain kind of critique of the Jews of being predatory. And it's just something to hold on to as we think about how Jews will negotiate where they belong in a progressive movement if they are associated with capitalism. Okay, so it's just food for thought. And we're going to move on now to the way Jewish socialists understood the role of Jewish commerce. So Jewish socialist and communist embrace of the working class. With industrialization came the rise of revolutionary movements throughout Europe, already beginning in 1848, and then going through the 1870s, the 1880s in Eastern Europe. The Jewish community in the Russian Empire was proletarianized. That is, it experienced a growth in proletariat light industry, artisanal trades, not in heavy industry. The Jewish community expanded enormously biologically in these years. And many of you will know that the Jewish community was not able to settle in the interior of Russia, except that mercantile elite I mentioned to you in the 1860s and 1870s in St. Petersburg. Most of Russian Jewish history unfolds in the western provinces of the Russian Empire, formerly Polish lands, also called the Pale of Settlement. What's important to understand is that revolutionary ideas capture the Jewish street in a whole variety of forms: Jewish socialism, Jewish anarchism, Jewish revolutionaryism, Jewish social Zionism, and later, of course, after the Bolshevik Revolution, Jewish communism. Concomitant with this revolutionary activity was secularization, right? A break with Jewish traditional life and an engagement with a secular way of bonding Jews to one another as a nation, as an ethnicity. And these ideologies of revolution, of socialism, Jewish secularism, migrated to the United States through the mass years of immigration from the late 1870s until 1924. And here I give you two examples, one which is one of my favorite visual images, and the other is a quote from the Workmen's Circle, now today renamed the Workers' Circle, which ran a secular Jewish school movement in the United States and in interwar Poland. And here we have part of their curriculum. What do they think a nice Jewish boy and girl should learn? By the way, of course, these schools were co-ed because gender equality is part of a socialist ethos. What should the children learn? They should be acquainted with the life of the worker and of the broad Jewish masses in America and other countries, with the episodes in general history of the struggle for freedom, to develop within them the feeling of justice, love for the oppressed, love of freedom, and respect for fighters for freedom, to develop within them idealism and the striving to perform noble acts necessary for every child of the oppressed class in making his way through life towards a better order. So you see here that the Jewish middle class is absent, right? What's the value of the workman's circle? Being a working man, being a proletariat, being a Jewish artisan, and teaching your children about oppression and about this labor struggles, right? So that should echo for some of you about our current moment. And on the right, you have a cartoon from a Yiddish humor magazine called The Big Stick, Der Greuselkundes, by William Gropper, who was a very well-known artist, who, by the way, also did paintings for Vanity Fair. So he didn't only paint for communist publications, but here you have, I just love it because I think it's so removed from what anyone imagines Jews were thinking about. Die ganze Macht dem Arbeiterklasse, right? All power to the working class, which is the slogan of socialism and communism in particular. And here you see a Jewish proletariat waving a flag and, supporting the Soviet Union. You see the hammer and the sickle, the two symbols of the transformation of labor: agricultural worker and industrial worker, a proletariat and a farmer. These are the values of the Jewish left in the 19th century. And of course, it informs Zionism. And there are all kinds of other ways Zionism is informed by this. You can think of A.D. Gordon, the attraction to working the land because of the revitalization of being in touch with the soil of Eretz Israel. But here you have a photograph from Kibbutz Gan Shmuel from 1946, 1947, from a parade. It was a Hashomer Hatzair Young Guard, which was a Marxist kibbutz movement founded in 1913. And as you can see, they strove, the ideology of this kibbutz movement, as well as others, was to normalize and productivize the Jews of Europe by transforming their work, by transforming their economic structure. They had to be more productive, and in so doing, they would become healthier modern Jews. So the Shomer Hatzair kibbutzim thrived on creating a new Jew, a Jew that was an industrial worker. They had factories on the kibbutzim, and being agricultural laborers. And they were chalutzim, they were pioneers. And they were, of course, influenced by the international socialist movement. They celebrated May Day. And they were committed to social justice and equality. And those are the theories, of course. We know as the kibbutz movement developed, all of this didn't reach fruition. But in their heyday, they actually created a collectivist ethos. This is the most successful socialist collectives were in Israel. And here you see a parade, and you see the kibbutzniks carrying their tools. And their tools are not accounting books or computers, right? Their tools are farm tools. So here you see the way the critique of Jewish middle-class activity, the critique of capitalism, has many threads or many streams into Marxism, into socialism, into Jewish secularism, and into the left-wing movements of the kibbutz, of the kibbutzim. So yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to try and figure why. Did I stop sharing already? No. Am I still sharing? Trying to find, oh, there we go. Sorry. And I'll take questions about this attitude towards the Jewish middle class and Jewish capitalism and Jewish work that's not manual labor and not industrial labor.
All right, so the questions that I have are a little bit from the previous section, if you're open to that.
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, it means the audience doesn't like my cartoon as much as I do. Well, that's all right.
The questions always, they have to process what you say and then
I know,
formulate their question.
That's fine.
Okay, so there were a couple questions about Marx. One is, why did he associate the Jews with money when the vast majority of the Jewish population were not titans of capitalism? And the second question that came in, which may or may not be part of the answer, is was Marx's view on Jews affected by his complicated relationship with his family and his own identity?
Okay, I can't speak to Marx's identity. He was baptized as a boy. I can't speak to that. But I will say, because that was maybe a little bit too sliding that question, it's that in the 19th century, an intellectual like Marx, who was the son of the bourgeoisie, everyone knew who the Jewish intellectuals were. It's not like they had Marx on their foreheads, but that would have been, the journalistic professions would have been something that would have drawn, modern Jewish types. So in that regard, Marx was well aware of his background, but I can't do a psychobiography of him in terms of on the Jewish question. Jews weren't titans of industry, but Jews were visible as being involved with commercial affairs. And that was true. And certainly in Western Europe, I mean, you have the phenomenon of the court Jews in the late 18th century. You have Jews were visible because they were Jews. So therefore, when they were in certain sectors of the economy, they would be visible. By the way, that's part of the medieval problem, right? Jews may or may not have been more involved with extending credit than other people, but because Jews were visibly non-Christians and Jews were visibly, in Western Europe, an urban minority, if a Jew did those things, it would be visible, quote, as a Jewish profession. And that's part of the issue. That's part of the problem. I mean, without sort of invoking anti-Semitism, that's the part of the problem of a minority group identity, right? The individual who is representative becomes blamed for a phenomenon, right? And that's not only true of Jews, but here we are talking about Jews. So I hope I addressed that question.
Yes, thank you. So somewhat related, one person was asking if the freedom to assimilate, or the invitation or the push to assimilate, did that give Jews a mistaken impression that they would receive protection from the state that they should not have been expecting?
That they should not have been what? I'm sorry, Ramayan,
that they shouldn't have been expecting. Did they, this invitation to sort of become part of the larger project here, did that imply falsely, and therefore you'll get the same, protection and support as everyone else? if that was even an expectation on other people's part, I'm not sure.
You know, it's a very good and complicated question, right? I mean, the way to rephrase it is, was the project of political emancipation an unfulfilled promise, right? And the problem with teaching European history is that everything ends up in 1930, right? And then in World War II. And so it's very difficult for anyone, particularly of a certain generation, to look back and say that the expectation that the state would be protective was a reasonable expectation, right? Again, it was in the interest of the state to maximize the utility of its subjects, and the Jews were its subjects. But anti-Jewish hatred, Judeophobia, anti-Semitism, so there we go, didn't end with political emancipation. And that's a fact. So that's the ambiguities of the modern project.
Right. All right, someone asked a question that's related to something I was thinking too. So I'm going to, with this person's permission, I hope, ask my version of the question. So the question about the workman's circle, and I don't know if you were planning to spend more time on it. And I guess I'll I don't know, betray my age or whatever. So my father's family was very connected to Workman's Circle. My grandmother directed a Workman's Circle camp. They were all in. But my impression of Workman's Circle growing up was, you know, it was about Yiddish culture. It was about, and it was, you know, it was a social club almost. I mean, their community and their musical life, which was a big thing in my family, was rooted in the Workman's Circle. But I didn't hear a word ever growing up about the philosophy of any of it and the workman's part of it. So I just wonder about that. Can you shed light on that transition to kind of
Sure.
how it evolved?
Well, Rabbi Amlin, it's a great question. I think it sort of tells you why you have to study history, right? Because your life experience, which is totally legitimate, already took place, if I can hazard a guess, not in a densely populated urban neighborhood of second generation American Jews, right? You were already, your parents were committed to the Yiddishkeit ethos, the secular Yiddishkeit, but the social class foundation of the Workman's Circle was no longer there because those Jews had become more upwardly mobile. They had become middle class. So and the other factor here, and this is really going to take us a little bit too far afield, but it's important to throw in the Cold War here a little bit, which is that in the post-World War II period, right, social class became associated with communism, and acculturating Jews, even Yiddish, left-wing Yiddishists, were very loath to sort of invoke the rhetoric that could blemish their reputations as being somehow sympathetic to communism. So both there was social class mobility on the part of these immigrants. Their children were now being raised in the suburbs, or they were middle class and they were going to go to American colleges and have nice professions. They weren't going to be piece workers in the subcontractors in the garment industry, and they weren't going to be, trade unionists. So the social class foundations of the Workman's Circle evaporate is not the word I want to use, but they become dissolved in post-war Jewish middle class life. But the Yiddish hold and the hold on secularism as a really powerful ideology, that means you can still feel really Jewish and have a social organization, you have a burial society, you have a credit association, you have healthcare without going to shul, even though I'm not saying your family did or did not. But that was extremely important. And you could still send your kids to a Jewish summer camp, And by the way, the curriculum of the Jewish summer camps, and one of my favorite figures who no one writes about is Leibish Lehrer, who ran Camp Boibelik, which was the Shalom Aleichem Folk Institute schools. And Leibish Lehrer was a secularist, but towards the end of his tenure as camp director, he introduced more and more rituals to encourage the feelings of Jewishness among these kids, because the kids no longer had even the Yiddish language, but they were secular. So I hope that answered, I hope Julie Rav Andelin, that solved some issues for you, but I'll say one thing about the Workman's Circle. Today's Workman's Circle, because they want to be part of the social justice agenda, have changed their name to the Workers' Circle. And I think it's both. I think it's so fascinating as an historian, because where are the Jewish workers? They're in high tech. in Silicon Valley. I mean, not everyone, of course. I'm not foolish, but the majority of the Jewish community is not laboring, 12 hours a day in a sweatshop, in a legal sweatshop.
Thanks for all of that. It's very helpful. Do you want to keep going? And then
Yeah. So now we're going to get to why you're all here, right? No, not really, but okay. I'm trying to. Okay, good. So this isn't why you're here, but shout out to me. This is a product of my fairly recent book, not so recent anymore, From Left to Right, Lucy S. Davidovich, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History. So what I want to do here in our remaining time, and I'm looking, is to give you a sense of the prescience of Lucy S. Davidovich, who was born in 1915 and lived to 1990, and who moved politically from left to right. But I want to give you a sense not only of her political journey in 4 seconds, but to give you a sense of her prescience about the writing of history and about the ambivalence in what she saw, the ambivalence among historians and Jewish social scientists, and to some degree, the Jewish community as a whole in the United States, the ambivalence about the successful upward mobility of the Jews, of East European immigrant Jews, right? And that is why she writes this essay that we're going to talk a little bit about. But why is it prescient? Because in the last 5-6 years in my field, meaning the field of modern Jewish history, there's been what's called the economic turn, a revisiting of Jewish upward mobility, of the fact that there has been a Jewish niche in the middle and upper middle classes. There's interesting projects now on, for example, even in England, I just saw this coming out, on Jews in country estates, Jewish gentlemen. So that speaks to the fact that the fear of the association of Jews and the predatory middle class, that maybe has abated a little bit, at least in the historical profession. I'm not sure it has abated in the world at large. And so that's a divide between intellectuals and the way most people, popular conceptions of Jews, but certainly there has been an economic turn in the writing of history. Lucy S. Davidovich was ahead of her time in many, many ways, and she asked the question about writing about the Jewish middle classes. But before she gets there, she was a youthful leftist. So I just wanted to give you a little sense of where she comes from. She's a Jewish immigrant daughter. She's raised in the interwar Bronx. She goes to Hunter High School for girls and then to Hunter College for women. And she also goes to the Sholem Lechem Folk Institute, which was a nonpartisan Yiddishist school movement, and also to their summer camp. So she's steeped in secular Yiddish culture, and she's also steeped in the dynamic political environment of her day. And she is a member of the Young Communist League when she goes to Hunter College, and she becomes editor, as you see on the left, of the literary magazine. It's called Echo. And in her youthful communism, she, and I guess the graphic designers, decided that the color of Echo should be red. And in the center, you have her editorial, which illustrates her commitment to communist, theory. Art, in order to flourish, must focus on, reveal the flux and flow of the lives of the masses of people. We're threatened by war and the imminence of fascism. The artist who creates culture, who cherishes and absorbs for his material the living pulse of the masses, must act against the obvious destruction and reaction that is bred by war and fascism, etc. It is the responsibility of the artist to destroy the myths which foster the war spirit, to reveal the paradox in our society of starvation and in abundance, and finally to clarify to the broad groups of workers, farmers, and intellectuals the organic relationship between war and fascism. So she is writing this at the time of the Popular Front. You can see the anti-war sentiment, which is widespread throughout the United States in these years, isolationism among more right-wing Americans, anti-war among left-wing Americans. So even though Hitler is now in power, there is reluctance to beat the drums of war. You also see her invoking farmers, in the masses, the industrial workers, as part of the communist left-wing agenda. On the right, you have a letter to her very good friend. Again, she's still in the Young Communist League, and she switched ribbons to say, down with the capitalist system, long live the Soviet Union. Again, to affirm for you that left-wing Jews, socialists and communists, saw the working classes and the communists saw the Soviet Union as fulfilling Marx's promise of a salvific society, communist society, where workers would be free and capitalists would not control them or their labor. In her life, she has a very dramatic life. She goes to Europe. She is in Vilna before World War II. She flees. She comes back to the United States. I could tell you more about her, but you can also read my book. And what I want to show you here is that she is working for the American Jewish Committee from 1949 to 1969. And she experiences, as did other middle-class American Jews, the upheavals of the 1960s and 70s. And the perception on the part of urban Jews, she lived in Queens and then moved to Manhattan, that the civic center and the urban center was falling apart. There was the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, the rhetoric of anti-Americanism, the militants of the civil rights movement. I'm thinking about the rise of the Black Panthers, the performance of violence, the New York City teachers' strike. Jews are perceived as middle class and as an obstacle to the mobility of Americans of color. Many Jews, not all the Jews, flee the urban center and suburbanize, often in neighborhoods that are exclusively white. There is the fallout from the Six-Day War. Zionism, which has been seen as a movement of the underdog, is now seen as a movement of an oppressor. The Palestinians are seen in the left as the oppressed, as the exploited by the Israeli military. And already in 1973 in Mexico City, there's a radicalization of the women's movement, again, a social movement of the 60s and 70s, and then the radicalization of the United Nations in 1975 with the Zionism as racism movement and condemnation. Commentary magazine, where Lucy S. Davidovich has written book reviews and other reviews while she was at the American Jewish Committee, starts to hold symposia about this issue of the relationship between capitalism, socialism, and democracy. There is the perception that only capitalism can produce a democratic society. And a democratic society is seen as safer for Jews, right? All the reasons why the American project, the American landscape, the foundational documents have offered to Jews an integrationist possibility of not being singled out, of being protected by the rule of law. So commentary posed a symposium about capitalism, socialism, and democracy, and they wanted to ask a bunch of intellectuals about the inescapable connection between capitalism and democracy, as well as the totalitarian temptation intrinsic to socialism, and they invited all these people to weigh in. I've given all of this to you to get a sense of Lucy Dawidowicz's world. She's associated with the American Jewish Committee. She's doing research on all of these issues. As an American Jew who's experienced violence in Europe, she is nervous, as many middle-class American Jews are, about the perception that the fabric of American society is falling apart. Remember, in the 60s, you have political assassinations, the Kennedy brothers, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, right? Students have taken to the streets. The society feels like it is no longer stable, and that makes middle-class Jews very nervous. And as she begins to cogitate about these issues, she starts to think about what she thinks are the biases in the writing of history. So she writes to her mentor, Max Weinreich, about looking at the history of productivization, those themes that we saw earlier in our session on making the Jews more productive, manual labor, industrial labor. And you see here what she says. And then at the bottom quote, you see that she is upset about Jewish intellectuals on the left, who she believes have a distorted view of the Jewish economy. And they are falling prey to Marxist rhetoric that is dangerous. They share the Marxist populist distrust of the merchant and the middleman, most escaping from, and she's very sarcastic, right? most, escaping from the bourgeois comforts of home, shout their contempt for the Jewish community, which for them is merely mama and papa. She's talking about the indulged youth of the anti-war movement. They have disdain for Judaism and its institutions. And here, by the way, the word Negro was common parlance. There was nothing offensive about it in the 60s, right? The National Association for Colored People, that's the NAACP. Other organizations use the word Negro. If you listen to speeches by Malcolm X and by Martin Luther King, by Bayard Rustin, that was the parlance of the day. And I am loath to switch as in storing the parlance of the day because we need to know how language changes, right? So she asks, to what extent have these Jews influenced Negroes, reinforcing Negro feelings of hostility, providing Negroes with ideological rationalization and psychological justifications of anti-Semitism? This is a memo she wrote in 1966. And here you see another memo about this question. There was anti-Jewish sentiment among disenfranchised urban Blacks that the Jewish merchant, the Jewish landlord, you see that the terminology, the landlord who is a Jew becomes a Jewish landlord. The merchant, the mom and pop store owner becomes a Jewish store owner. So a sociological economic niche becomes categorized as something that's intrinsically Jewish and therefore problematic. And that is what she's reacting to. Exploitation is here being used in a pejorative sense, a usage becoming increasingly common. When used to describe Negro-white customer-merchant relation, the word suggests that the merchant is basely, illegitimately, and unethically taking advantage of his customer. It invokes the Marxist definition of exploitation in the image of the bloodsucker, making profit from the labor of others. To counter these charges and the increased use of the term, research had to be conducted. She's telling this to her peers at the AJC. The most basic question she suggested was at what point does legitimate business and exploitation begin? I think there's a typo there. She's asking, when is the business by a merchant legitimate and when does it become exploitative? In other words, is capitalism always wrong? Is capitalism always predatory? And what is her concern? If Jews are involved with the capitalist economy, if Jews are in the middle classes, are they by definition oppressive, exploitative? That's the question. And that's the question of her day. And I would argue today. So what happens? She decides to write an essay. As I said, it doesn't get published until after her death in a collection put together by Neil Kozady, her literary executor. And she asked this question: I want to know how Jews in America made a living from 1789 until 1967. The terminus ad quem means the end point, which I've set for my history. She set out to do a social history of the Jewish middle classes. There are over 37 boxes in her research notes held at the American Jewish Historical Society with the Xeroxes, memos, transcripts, book reviews, credit histories. She went through the credit histories of Dun and Bradstreet. She looked at Jewish peddlers. She looked at Jewish shop owners throughout the country. She never wrote a full study of this, but she was onto something that today historians are looking at: how to explain the extraordinary socioeconomic mobility of the Jewish immigrants. Anyone, I'm thinking back to Rabbi Andelman's question: what happened to the working class ethos of the workman's circle? What happened to the working class ethos of the workman's circle is that there were no more Jews in the working class as a majority phenomenon. The Jews had become successfully middle class. And if Jews are successfully middle class, where do they belong in a redress of social inequality in our country? And she anticipated some of the problems. And the essay is, in that regard, very, very prescient. And her methods are also quite maverick, to look at the documents of social history on the Jewish middle classes, not looking at how people are thinking, even though she's interested in ideas, what they're doing, how they're making a living, and how they're making a living throughout the United States. And here she says, I would like to restore to the merchant and businessman the recognition of their social usefulness and the moral dignity of which they were stripped first by the French Enlightenment, then by the German Marxists, and finally by the East European revolutionaries. So in many ways, she is saying what I outlined for you, right? The distrust, the ambivalence of Jewish commercial activity, Jewish middle class activity, Jews and their engagement to some degree with the capitalist economy. This ambivalence is an inheritance of European history and of the integrationist process and of the fear of economic anti-Semitism, that somehow the Jews, in Marx's words, are, predacious, right? Because commerce and money are bad. All of us, she says, by the force of Jewish tradition, and I think she means Jewish historical tradition, are heirs to these ideas which for generations have denigrated trade and commerce and which have romanticized the peasant and the proletariat. So back to our beginnings. What do you think? Do you think being middle class, which has afforded American Jews an unprecedented level of integration and security into the society, is a value that should be celebrated, as did Lucy S. Davidovich? Or do you think that the predominance of Jews in the middle class puts them on the wrong side of the social justice critique today? Is there a way to reconcile the socioeconomic status of the Jews with a commitment to the progressive causes championed on the left and among young Jews, right? Among young people? What are the obstacles, if there are obstacles, for Jews to be part of the current progressive moment in American politics, if you want to be part of that moment? If the Jewish community, speaking broadly, views the middle class as a bulwark of civic stability, what roles can it play in movements to redress socioeconomic equality, right? And here I think about representation in professions where Jews have been predominant, the professoriate, the talking professions, the legal fields. What's going to happen if, to be socially just, there will be less room for Jews in those professions, which have been a bulwark of Jewish middle class status, and also a sense that they afforded Jews security in civic society? Can the Jewish community reconfigure its own values of upward socioeconomic mobility, be more in sync with progressive social groups? Should it, right? Being mobile economically is a value in the Jewish community, right? In other words, can the Jewish community be an ally in the social justice agenda for the redistribution of wealth? So we're not going to answer all those questions, but I think they're great questions for your Shabbos tables, and I'll take a few questions now, or conversations about these topics. And I want to again emphasize that I think Lucy S. Davidovich, and few people know this essay, really saw, as she did with so many things, she saw the complexities of Jewish middle class status vis-a-vis left, progressive, liberal social movements of her time, and that we're seeing today.
Thank you so much. What questions to end on? My head is spinning. All right, so sorry about that.
I'm trying to get rid of the share. Did I get rid of the share? Oh, there. Oh, you want me to, I'll stop sharing. And yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so one person asks, in the current economy, this is the setup, in the current economy, those who make their living through manipulating capital are wealthy and the working class much less so. So this person's asking, was the movement for the Jews from the usury professions to the working class an improvement or not in standards of living?
I'm a little unsure what you mean by improvement. And also usury, I really do think the word, the extension of credit is about, usury is so Christological and theologically laden. So I always tell my students that. You rarely see the word usury without predatory or extortion, there's some other qualifier.
Right.
When you say an improvement, I don't know what improvement is. I think that I would say one of the challenges is that, at least as the way I see it, and I'm happy to be corrected, no parent in the Jewish community says, really want my daughter to become an industrial laborer, right? That's, what do they say? You know what they say. So-and-so went to this elite school. So-and-so has this kind of economic mobility, right? And of course, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be economically secure. But I'm asking the question, if that has been a value since the 20s and 30s, and if the Jewish community has been successful in being upwardly mobile, how does the Jewish community as a whole participate in a social justice agenda which emphasizes the fact that American workers have been completely left behind? You know, that has been the result of Reaganomics from the 70s. I mean, again, we could talk more about it, but, you know, the New Deal, you know, under Roosevelt, tried to create a much broader social welfare net and a healthier way of working, and OSHA and Social Security, everything that you know, which many of us are beneficiaries of. But that social welfare net has been eroded in our society, and for all kinds of reasons. The tax code, the middle class welfare mortgages. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I have experienced it. I know. So the question is, how will Jews position themselves now when there is increasing call for a redistribution of wealth? And the Jewish community has benefited from its socially economic mobility in the 20th century.
Okay, now there's like 100 questions popping up at me in the chat, so it's hard to sift through all of them. I think one trend I'm noticing is some resistance or maybe even defensiveness. I guess some challenging of your definition of social justice. Does it need to be linked to redistribution of wealth? A few people have mentioned Jewish philanthropy, which has been enabled by capitalism, as, you know, in turn supporting various social justice movements and all of the Jewish organizations, Jewish social justice organizations that depend on that philanthropy to do that good work.
So first of all, I'm trying to pose a series of questions, right? I'm not, so if you perceive that I think, you know, I mean, I know well the history of revolutions, and I'm very skeptical of the expropriation of wealth. I do think we need a more progressive tax code. So full disclaimer, I do think we need a more progressive tax code. But obviously Jewish philanthropy from, and I'm talking about the late 18th century again, the court Jews who were maligned in European historiography, but those of us who study the court Jews know how important they were. Jewish philanthropy has been extraordinarily important, not only for the recipients, but for the Jews giving the money as a form of Jewish identity, and also transnationally, you know, JDC. And, you know, I am certainly not saying Jewish philanthropy has not been of value. I am just asking the question, if the social justice movements of today do address economics, and by the way, that they haven't as much as, frankly, I think they should. Our society is tangled up in race. Now, a racial reckoning, in my view, again, full disclaimer, I think is incredibly important. But race is not the only reasons why our society is fissuring at this moment, right? We know the rural poor have been left behind. We know the underemployed, you know, they're all, socioeconomics are fundamental. So I'm just asking the question, if social justice includes a socioeconomic you know, tenant or what prong, how will the Jewish community understand itself? And I think it's a challenge, because the Jewish community is self-sustaining, right? You can't have Jewish institutions unless you have Jewish philanthropy, right? You know, there are tax breaks, which is how these things work. And that's another whole issue about the church and state, but the Jewish community is self-supporting, right? Day schools, seminaries, you know, projects, academic centers, right? So I'm not going after Jewish philanthropy. I'm just asking the question in this political moment that we're in, how will the Jewish community articulate its commitment to social justice if there is a socioeconomic aspect of it?
Thank you.
And by the way, I don't think it should be avoided. You know, I think that it shouldn't be avoided. I think it's important for our society to think about all kinds of reckonings. And one is the way the working poor and the rural poor have been left behind by the promise of the 20th century. We know that.
So I think you addressed this, but I'm still getting comments about it. So I'll put it out there to speak for the masses here. A number of people are, I think they're reading your questions as implying that Jews should be ashamed of our success, or that by having done well and moved up in class, that have we done something wrong. I think you just addressed that, but it's still coming out.
Wait, I just want to say something. I'm accused. I wrote a book on a neoconservative who championed capitalism. So I think that I don't think the defensiveness comes from me. I think these are important questions. I think Jews should be ashamed. I think Jews have to wrestle with a commitment to social justice, a commitment to being part of the reckoning that our society is going through, and a recognition. Look, let's take the most obvious example. Many, many Jews who are committed to the continuity of the Jewish people double tax themselves by sending their children to day school. I think that's a value, but it means that Jews have opted out of the debates over public education. That's a socioeconomic issue. Full stop. I'm not saying it's bad or good. I'm just saying the Jewish community has to think about this. What is the investment in public education now among the Jewish community? I'm not being defensive or critical. I'm saying to my mind, these are the questions that Americans need to face and Jewish Americans need to face. That's what I'm saying.
You're really tapping into. We have Board of Education elections in my town, along with the upcoming larger elections, and right. And I pay my taxes to support public education. I do not partake of it in my family, and I'm struggling so hard to know how to vote because I'm so uneducated, because I'm not part of the system.
So I want to thank you, Rabbi Endelin, because I think that's the point. And in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, Jews did send their kids. Not everyone. There were always Jews who opted out. There were always day schools. There were always yeshivas. And I am not criticizing that at all. I understand the challenges of creating a literate Jewish community without day school. I could go on and on about it. I don't think I need to do that, but that's the civic fabric. Public education is a civic institution. And the majority, not the majority, because many Jews still send their kids to public education, but there has been a turn towards day school. So I just want to thank you for having my back there, because it's not that I'm defensive, it's that I think these are questions that we face.
Yeah. Right, and I'm not going on about myself, but I'm a product of public school education. So it's right. I feel in a way like I've taken myself out of it, but in a way that I don't want to. All right, so let me get back to. So let's turn to a different theme. Someone asked if you could elaborate on. You had listed those various destabilizing factors. I think in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And you talked about Jewish mobility as an obstacle to the mobility of Americans of color. And there was a little bit more about racial issues. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Again, this is something that I think is very hard look, first of all, not all American Jews are white, but American Jews get coded as white. Some of in the 1880s, 1890s, Jews were considered Asiatic, Oriental, right? It's all these terms. That's why terminology is so important. And then by the post-war period, Jews are coded increasingly as white, and we're able to benefit. We all know this, the way the GI Bill gets, disseminate, who's at housing issues, where people could have leisure activities. So this is one of the challenges is American Jews don't see themselves as white, but the society sees them as white. And Jews are upwardly mobile and not that cognizant of the systemic obstacles that are placed for Americans of color. You know, walking into a bank, walking to a mortgage brokerage, walking to a neighborhood and wanting to buy a house. Those things, not that Jews didn't suffer from social anti-Semitism in certain neighborhoods. We know about quotas, we know about distribution requirement, you know, in colleges. There is social anti-Semitism, but you can't really compare the social anti-Semitism that affects American Jews to the systemic racialized obstacles, you know, let alone Jim Crow and segregation. I mean, it's apples and oranges. So Jewish mobility is there. Is it to blame? Again, I don't want anyone to say, oh, you know, you hired someone who's, you know, but no, I don't think Jews are to blame, but Jews participated often unwittingly in a system that they may not have been aware of that created enormous obstacles to people of color. There's no doubt, and to my mind, that's unquestionable.
So we only have a couple minutes, and I can't even, you wouldn't even believe what's going on in my chat here, but so
well, you can send it to me.
I will. I will. So let me end with a question that's maybe a little bit less charged than some of what we've been talking about, which is how would you, or maybe not, how would you place Lucy Dawidowicz in kind of you know, the political or thought leadership landscape today?
You know, that's, thank you. That's sort of everyone's favorite question. Someone said to me the other day, is she Barry Weiss? Is she Dara Horn? Is she Ruth Weiss? You know, and I always say, I have no idea, because, you know, that's my privilege and prerogative as an historian. She died in 1990. It's hard to know. What I will say is that the men of her generation who were the neoconservatives, most of them, except for Norman Podhoretz, are no longer in the world. So we have seen the next generation, Irving Kristol's son, and we see Bret Stephens, who's not related to anyone as far as I know, move away from, they still see themselves as neoconservatives, but they've moved away from an identification with the Republican Party. And again, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. I think it's fair to say that the Republican Party of the 80s is not the Republican Party of today. And so there has been a retrenchment on the part of conservatives and Jewish conservatives because of the attack on civil society. Again, that whole question of civil society is so critical, that and the xenophobia and everything we know. So where Lucy S. Davidovich would have put herself, I don't exactly know. Ruth Weiss, who's a great, great scholar, a great mind of Yiddish literature, she has remained a supporter of the Republican Party. Bret Stephens and Bill Kristol and others have removed themselves. I don't know where she would situate herself. What I will say is what makes her so interesting is she got all the questions right. And they're hard questions.
Right.
And that's why she's interesting.
That's why
she's interesting.
Yeah. All right, so that's a perfect note to end on. So thank you so much. You have people very engaged, and many people are writing saying they want more of this and they want to audit your courses. And so thank you for you know, just a very stimulating lecture. You know, pushing us to think about how we relate to work of different types in terms of our values, and how that has shifted throughout our historical context. It's wonderful. And it actually is somewhat related topic next week. You didn't discuss gender explicitly, although I know that that's, I think that that's one of the big reasons you wanted to study Lucy Dawidowicz, but Dr. Shira Epstein, who's dean of our education school here at JTS, her session next Monday is called "A Nice Jewish Teacher: How American Elementary Education Became Women's Work." So we will pick up on the gender theme next week, and I would guess some of the class issues as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you once again for teaching a terrific and very, very stimulating lecture. We hope to.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Endelman, and thank you, Tani Schwartz-Harriman. I think I reversed your names before I called.
All right, hope to
Always
see many
happy
of you
to be here.
Thanks.
Bye.